So if we think of Industry 5, move past Industry 4.0 and start talking about Industry 5.0 and the sort of benefits of technology for society. And I think we have a whiteboard moment, where we can map out how we want to work and design things, starting from engineering and design things the right way. And based on that whiteboard of how we want to work. And I don't think we're doing enough of that yet. I really, so the question I would ask is, how do you envision that factory to work in the future? How do we want it to look like? And then let's put the automation, technology, electrification in place to allow that to happen. And how do we get more active in planning that future as opposed to letting it happen? Because I feel right now we're still sort of letting it happen.
Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we're piecing together the puzzle of the ever-changing world of work, one question at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today we're diving into the future of work in manufacturing. To explore this, I'm joined by Gregory Tink, Digital Transformation Director at Schneider Electric. Hey, Gregory, welcome to the Future of Less Work.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining. I'm actually really excited to speak with you today because a lot of times we get confused by thinking that all the future of work changes have to do with knowledge workers and, tech industry, but they don't, right? So what's that piece you're working on?
Well, my job is to work with our clients, Schneider Electric's clients, and help them transform to what they see as a vision of their future of work. And so we are, at heart a manufacturer. We have 200 manufacturing plants around the world, and so we build all sorts of technology and equipment, of course, but along the way, companies were asking us how we were able to transform ourselves using digital tools and transform ourselves to become more sustainable, and ultimately how we've managed to retain and attract people through that process. So we get a lot of those questions. So my job and my group's job is to work with clients to figure out how to apply that in their own operations. So we are focused on operations, but of course, operations and what happens at the site affects what happens in the enterprise and vice versa. So we don't just work on the plant floor. We work, obviously to coordinate the data and information and process to the top floor as well.
Yeah, so I worked for Intel for almost 3 decades, and I know manufacturing isn't the noisy, dirty kind of environment with lots of machines. So it's not the assembly line of once, but it still kind of suffers from a perception, right? That it is a relatively repetitive, not very desirable kind of tech related industry, doesn't it?
I think in some cases, yes. It's like in any industry, it comes packaged with preconceptions of what it is, and I think there's probably some validity historically to the factory being a dirty, grimy place. But that isn't the case anymore, and these are highly technical environments where we have to use automation technology. We have to look at electrification, and we are. The digital companies have to digitize, automate, and electrify to a degree that they've never had to before in history.
So
And with that,
what does that do to the people on the factory floor?
yeah,
Or maybe not only
very,
in the factory floor?
yeah, exactly. And we have to bring people along in that journey. And uh, what it does with the people, for the most part, is that it excites them, it gets them involved, and realistically, we're facing a future where we won't have enough people to work the way we used to work, and so we have to digitize, we have to automate, and so the
So hold
people,
on. So
yeah,
I want to stop you there for a second because
yeah,
a lot of people don't accept, understand, or wouldn't agree with that statement. We keep hearing this conversation about where's the power, right? So is the people, so they get to define, or is it the organizations? And so there's this conversation going on that as technology comes in, we can do more with less people. So people have
Mhm.
to align themselves. So why are you saying that
Well,
there's
I,
not
I
enough
guess
people?
it is a misconception that technology replaces people. That's never been the case. I've never seen that throughout my career where we brought in technology and all of a sudden we had drastic reduction of headcount. That's usually not the case. And what we're actually finding with our factories as we digitize and as we automate and as it becomes more of a data driven environment, we actually need more people to work with the data and work differently. They're just doing different things. They're not necessarily more people on the factory floor doing the work that the next generation doesn't want to do. They're working outside of the factory floor and helping in other areas using data, and really they're empowered more than they used to be.
So you're seeing a shift in the types of
Mhm.
jobs and the skill sets and the types of people that you have to
Absolutely.
employ.
Yes,
So what does that
absolutely.
shift look like? So because again, I mean I do remember this. I even remember this from Intel manufacturing over the years, right? If you could take like high school people and then you needed to get in, people with some level of degrees, and so we changed what we needed them to be doing because really they weren't manufacturing. They were, equipment operators or machines that
Mm.
were, for all sense of purposes, big computers, right? So what
Yeah.
do you see? How does that change the people?
Well, our plant floors are more safe than they ever have been. They're cleaner, to your point earlier, and there are less people on them, and the repetitive jobs are being replaced in a lot of areas, and the jobs to move things around the factory floor are being replaced by technology. So whether that's robotics, motion tools, there's less vehicles moving around, so it's a safer environment just generally, and that all comes back to technology and the ability, instead of having to go out to the plant floor to check the status of something and walk around. Well, if you have a single pane of glass that you're looking at, that you can look and compare different factories or processes and lines within a single factory, you don't need to go and look for the data to and put it on a bulletin board. You've actually got it in your fingertips from your office and
So
or
how does
from
that
wherever you
change
are.
the types of people that manufacturing is looking to hire these days?
It
Or
it well it definitely appeals more to a younger generation, because it's with a younger generation, we talk a lot about their expectations, but it's actually more of a requirement now. It's not just that they expect it, they require it, because when you're coming into these new digital factories, they expect more digital, they expect more technology, they expect more data at their fingertips so they can make decisions. But it's a requirement, and an expectation from that next generation, as opposed to what we used to talk about. Well, they expect to be able to use iPads and technology. It's now a requirement in these environments to have that technology, because you literally can't do the jobs we're asking them to do unless that technology is in place.
so is there a, I mean, you said there was a shortage or we're expecting there to be a shortage. Is there a gap between the perception of what manufacturing used to be, or maybe there are aspects that are not perception because we talk a lot about flexibility, for example, right? And how do you
Mhm.
introduce flexibility in an environment that is physical location driven?
Yeah, it absolutely, and I think that we're seeing, there's a couple of things there. We're seeing a trend to build factories where there are the population and the people that we need to work in the factories. So there's more of a partnership with universities so they can learn the skills and bring those, when they graduate, they look at manufacturing as something they want to do,
So
because they
you're building a pipeline.
We're
basically.
building that pipeline
Yeah.
with universities, and I think we have to do more of that. They have to use our technology more and more so that when they come into the plants, they're ready to work in these jobs and see them as interesting, highly technical, dynamic positions, as opposed to the picture in some people's heads of backbreaking work and more ports or type environments. It's not like that. It's again clean, but also very data driven environments at this
Yes. So
point.
one clear way to do that is to meet the young people at universities as part of their education to bring
Yes.
manufacturing into the perspective in terms of the things that they can do there. Do you? Is it like different? I was going to say professions, and I stopped myself because I think we don't teach professions anymore. But is it different from the? Do they have other choices, or have they chosen to study something that would lead them to work in these high tech manufacturing facilities?
I, I think there's still a lot of university students that are taking, obviously engineering and technical degrees of some sort. So they're choosing that. But we're also seeing, like the University of Kentucky with, a actual group inside that's focused on sustainable manufacturing. And, we're seeing the universities build programs and laboratories using the technology to really get students, number one, aware, but also trained in the future technologies that they need to be using. And so that behooves companies like Schneider to be there as partners with them, so that they're using our technology because we want them to get trained on our technology, but also we help develop those thought leaders for our industry in the future, so that when they come in to work in our factories, they see that this is a continuous improvement environment that they're empowered to help take to that next level,
Yeah,
and take
which
over
is
from. Yeah.
another really interesting one, right? Because we think of of manufacturing as a slower cycle, kind of a change, and you're talking about something a little more dynamic.
Yeah.
How about the people skills that we do we need them, or are they mostly, still the ability to operate whatever the environment is?
I think the people skills become more important, which is also, I think, an attraction to the next generation, because it, like, socially we have to still think of the people. We have to prop them up for success. We have to empower them. I think
How?
underlying that, and I think it's one of the ways how is leadership has to change. We have to think differently as leaders. The command and control days of the past, we are obsolete, and that concept of, of I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. I'm going to interpret all the data as a manager, and this is how the factory will be run. That's no longer the case. If you're in continuous improvement mode with all the data that is coming to you, you have to delegate and you have to empower. And we need those leaders and thinkers that come from universities that take over that mindset.
Yeah, I actually think you touch on one of the things that are probably still barriers to hiring the talent that you need, because I do think that there's a whole, from my experience in multiple organizations, there's a whole layer of management that grew up in the old days of manufacturing, and manufacturing was
Yes.
more structured command and control, as you said, right? And then we're bringing in people and we're asking them to make real-time decisions based on real-time data with the tools that they have, and so they expect to be managed that way, and they expect to have more of a what we call a high-tech kind of culture around them in terms of development and careers and dynamics. And I'm not sure we've got that. I think they're taking longer to adjust the cultural aspects.
I I think that you're right. I think we're working on it. I don't think we're finished working on it. And I think it's something that needs to accelerate in manufacturing, so that we can retain and attract the right people that come in, that next generation that's ready for that future work sort of concept, and what that looks like in the future. Ultimately, we don't know what that looks like completely. We have some ideas based on our current state, but as we evolve, it'll evolve as it needs to, in the direction it needs to, and we have to be prepared for that. There's two aspects to it too. One is allowing it to happen, but what's also important is sort of innovating with direction. Because if you innovate in all directions, you end up wasting a lot of money, and everybody's going to solve the problem themselves. So I think what's also important is having organizations that can balance the innovation required at site, the empowerment of people, with the need for standards and direction to the innovation, because that balance is really important. We It's not a free for all, going forward, where every factory is allowed to be different. It has to be standardized, and a lockstep approach where there's a governance body over top of the factories that steer the innovation, the proof of concepts and pilots in the right direction with technology to
Yeah,
make
and
sure
and
we're getting the most
and
out of it.
that's part of the challenge to the culture that is shifting because
Absolutely.
I mean you're right, but these are like there's a bit more. I don't know. I was going to say heaviness, right? There's a bit more structure to, but because you can't fail fast and you can't. I mean, it's different, right? The cost
Yeah.
structure is different. Everything's bigger impact. But by when you do that, it's a little more, it's a little harder for young people coming up from the bottom to push innovation and ideas and change through the system. And that's a big challenge.
It is. And I think that it we have to do this, and it's one of those things where, we just have to figure it out, I guess, because yes, it can be harder when there's more layers to it and there's governance, but we have to keep that nimbleness because we have to continue to learn. Part of the problem, and it's a good problem to have, is that technology is changing so quickly, and there's so many varieties of technology that if you and I went out and did research into what robots we should buy to do the same process, and we're both in separate factories, we're both going to come back with a different list. We might have some overlap, but we're probably going to have different favorites and different things that we
And why
want.
is that a good problem to have?
It's a good problem to have because there is more it, it- there's more ability to be creative, to think outside the box, and to have different types of technology that is perfectly good to support us. And so that's positive because we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of change, and we can adapt that and move it into our factories. It's a bad it's bad for us, because obviously if we don't control it and don't do it the right way, in a careful way, and direct the innovation, we'll have 7,000 different types of technology to solve the same problem,
Yeah, and there
and
we're
that's a
back in the same
yeah.
problem,
And
right? So I'm
yeah.
curious. I wanted to ask you, getting back to kind of the some of the future of work meets manufacturing, right? Part of how we're seeing the evolution and people's expectations has to be with more autonomy, more control. I've heard conversations about things like micro shifts or, different ways to work within the factory that allow, because it's clearly not a and not a flexibility as defined by remote work environment, although one can question, and we saw that even when COVID demanded it in a higher degree of risk, we figured out ways to do that
Hmm.
too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So where are we seeing the change in this aspect of careers and the way people have control over their work?
Yeah, it goes back to the delicate balance between, empowering people to improve and innovate, but also directing that innovation. And I think that's a nuance we can't ignore with that question. Is that we have to have that balance, where we used to have automation islands. Each factory was its own little island of technology and leadership on its own. And if they met their production targets, they were pretty much left alone. And now we're seeing usually a more integrated working environment where the enterprise is doing things with the site, and the site needs to work with the enterprise. And because of the data that is available, we're seeing dashboards obviously across the site. So the sites get compared to each other. So it's not just, are you creating enough widgets in a certain amount of time? It's, are you the most efficient, the most sustainable? And because you can compare sites to each other, you see healthy competition within the sites, and you see people striving to make improvements, and drive change quicker, so that.
What about in how I think I'm trying to bring this back to how people manage careers, because part of the ability to attract the younger
Mhm.
generation is also to give them what they want. Part of it, as you've touched upon, is the interesting environment and the innovation and the dynamic work and the technology. Parts of it has to do with um, shift structure, control, the ability to do other things. Are
Yep.
you seeing any changes in that
uh,
respect?
ab- Absolutely. And I think that we're, because of the standardization, we're creating more opportunities for moving people quicker and trying different things. And so moving from one factory to another, leadership bringing what they learned at one factory, going to another factory, applying what they learned, but also engineers that are coming in to solve specific problems, and they're there for a period of time, and then they're moving out. We're seeing more fluidity between
Okay.
different factories with organizations. Of course, it's you have to point out that smaller organizations that maybe have two factories, there's less opportunity to move around the globally, because they maybe only have two factories.
Yeah.
But the concept is still applicable, where we are seeing people able to move, able to have more decisions on what they work on as well, because you need, with the continuous improvement, you need people to put up their hand and say, I have an idea, because it can't be the same person having every idea that drives the company forward. You have to
Clearly.
bring the ideas up in and get management to notice them, and then apply that back into the facilities.
So we're 5 years from COVID. Can you kind of, do you have a sense of how we've changed since COVID? What's different now than in how manufacturing is as an employer, as a career, than it was 5 years ago?
I think there's an ag it there it woke us up in some ways, and we saw that we could do and see things remotely, where we didn't really think about that before. And not just in manufacturing, of course, in office jobs, and the fact that we're having this conversation over Teams. Those are things that we opened ourselves up to, the experiences and that are new for us. And I think that all of that applies directly to the facility, to the plant floor, um, with manufacturing, the expectations that come along with that. And also, there's obviously we're all a little bit socially awkward for, because, and it's true, and I think we're still recovering from that in a lot of ways, where we're trying to figure out, well, how do we um, do things, in and that from a social perspective. And so that next generation that's already coming into our factories, they had a lot of their education was actually over Teams calls and Zoom calls, and they missed some of that social aspect. So they're coming into working environments, you know, uncertain about how to make things work. And I've actually been in office spaces where I've seen the next generation on Teams calls in the same room, and so there's different dynamics with that, and some of them are positive
Interesting.
because we're
Interesting.
able to do more outside of the workspace. We can wake up in the morning and see this exactly what's happening in the factory before we go to work while we're getting ready to shower. And there's positive and negatives to that because your work life balance is now more about work life integration than work life balance, where
Yeah,
you
it
separate
never
the
it
two.
never was a balance, but I think
I would
that's
agree with that. Yeah.
yeah, that's part of it, right? Because you could say, okay, there's things we could do outside of the physical space
Yeah.
remotely. So do we always have to go into the physical space, or does that allow us to structure jobs differently? I do remember one of the things I observed during COVID as we were studying this is even, for example, sometimes we saw engineers who had to stay away because we were, we wanted to minimize the number of people on the floor, would coach the people in the factory floor to do things that they normally wouldn't do. And they'd coach them remotely. And that wasn't all bad because you
Yeah.
actually changed how we design jobs. So
I
that's going to be an
agree.
interesting
Yeah.
thing to
And
watch.
the other thing that I'm seeing is a lot of people coming back to offices. And so a typical manufacturing factory will, it'll have a front office space and then, the actual plant floor in the back, just, and I'm from, because I go to a lot of different sites and I'm seeing more people in that front office space than I had even a year and a half to 2 years ago. So I
Yeah.
think people are coming back because they need to be around people, and the
Yeah.
jobs are more enjoyable if they're around people. So that what we're seeing though is a flexibility to some days work from home, some days work in the factory, depending on the job. There's still jobs where your job is to be at the end of the assembling line, maybe to put some things together, and that you have to be there for that.
Yeah, or
Or
to be able to really
exactly.
quickly go approach
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
clearly. That's fascinating. So, just kind of as we wrap up, I'm wondering if you speed a little bit, kind of, I don't know, 3 years into the future, and we haven't even said AI yet. Um, how do you see this evolving? So, how do you vision manufacturing
Yes,
in a few
I think
years?
it's going to revolutionize our way of working yet again, and we're just starting to understand it. Where most companies are still working on AI readiness, I would call it, but we're seeing big wins with machine learning, AI, preventative maintenance, visual AI, visual systems that are getting more
Yeah.
sophisticated, and I think that's just going to accelerate. I think in the future we'll see artificial intelligent agents that are very specific to certain processes that will prod and steer how we operate and what how we manufacture based on what they're learning, from the data. And I think we'll start to see more of those types of things, like overlaying of commercial and operations, so that the decisions are made quicker on, profitability. And I call it real time accounting, and I think that's been something that's been talked about for a while. But we didn't really have the systems to allow us to integrate the way we do now,
Yeah,
and
I
now we
agree.
do. So I think we're going to see a lot of that, and it's of course going to be driven by the need to do it because we won't have as many people like we've talked about as far as the big macro trend to work in the factories, and also the expectation of those people to start overlaying and seeing data that we can't even imagine right now what we're going to learn from that data.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, as you said, right? The people that you're trying to hire, they have a lot of other options, and so you need to stay on par with those other options in terms of the kind of challenge and environment and the ability to innovate and the level of the tools that are available to people.
Yes, absolutely. And I really believe that we're just starting to understand that. I think Elon Musk or someone said the other day that we're actually at a point where, you know, we AI is done as much as it can with the data that's available, and we're at a saturation point, and I think in the consumer space, we see some of these co-pilot chat GPTI, and I understand where he's coming from, from that perspective, because you ask a question, but when we think of AI on the plant floor and industrial AI, I don't think we've really started that journey, to be
Yeah, I
honest.
agree.
We're just barely poking at it, and that to me is where AI will really really drive changes in how we work, because it the data is so fluid and the processes are so complex. We can't manage the data by ourselves, so
Yeah,
we
I
need
I I
AI.
think that's gonna be a driver for a lot of these new tools.
Yeah.
So, let me ask you this one question I always try to wrap up with. Um, Instead of an answer, what's the one question you think we should all be asking ourselves these days about the future of work?
Well, great. That's awesome. I think the big question. It's sort of a question, but it's how do we want to work in the future? And I don't think we're necessarily actively steering it the way we should. As so, if we think of Industry 5, move past Industry 4.0 and start talking about Industry 5.0, and the sort of benefits of technology for society. And I think we have a whiteboard moment, where we can map out how we want to work and design things, starting from engineering and design things the right way. And based on that whiteboard of how we want to work. And I don't think we're doing enough of that yet. I really, so the question I would ask is, how do you envision that factory to work in the future? How do we want it to look like? And then let's put the automation, technology, electrification in place to allow that to happen. And how do we get more active in planning that future as opposed to letting it happen? Because I feel right now we're still sort of letting it happen as opposed to grabbing it and designing it for that in a certain way.
Yeah, the whiteboard moment, I love that. It's actually come up in a previous episode, with Rishad Tubakawala. He said the same thing about organizations. It's like, how would you design it if you had a white,
Yes.
a blank paper, and you probably the answer is not the way it is today, and we keep
Yep.
fixing what is, and this I love whiteboard moment. Definitely going to adopt and credit you with that. So thank you
Yeah. Awesome.
so much. Thank you very much, Gregory, for joining me today. For more about Gregory Tink and his work at Schneider Electric, check out the links in the podcast description. Thank you for joining us on The Future of Less Work, where we're piecing together the ever-changing puzzle of work. And remember, the new social contract has to be a win-win between people and organizations. Your best people do not work because they have to, or you tell them to, or you measure them on it. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they're doing what they want to achieve in life. Until next time, keep exploring, asking those questions. See you next time.